On July 29th, at the Egyptian port of Damietta, a floating LNG storage terminal caught fire. Minutes later, a tanker moored beside it was burning too. No group claimed responsibility. No government confirmed a cause. But maritime security analysts pointed to suspected drone strikes, and here's why that detail matters more than almost anything else that happened this month. Damietta sits at the northern gateway to the Suez Canal, and if you've been following this war at all, you already know 2 other choke points have been under siege. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively shut since the end of February. The el-Mandeb Strait between Yemen and Djibouti has been under a declared blockade since July 20th. Now, a third artery, the last one left, just took a hit 5 miles from one of the busiest canal approaches on Earth. 3 choke points, 1 month. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you why a 230-year-old warning from George Washington describes what's happening in the Gulf right now with a precision that should genuinely unsettle you. Let's get into it. The framework before the evidence, you need the map. There are exactly 3 maritime corridors that let Gulf oil reach the rest of the world without sailing around the entire African continent. Every one of them has a choke point an adversary can squeeze. Choke point 1, the Strait of Hormuz. The exit from the Persian Gulf itself. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through here on an ordinary day. Iran has held effective control over it since the war began. Choke point 2, el-Mandeb, the narrow gate between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This is the route Saudi Arabia built its entire workaround strategy on. Choke point 3, the northern Red Sea and Suez approach, the last resort. If ships can't use Hormuz and can't use el-Mandeb, this is where they funnel. Or they go around Africa entirely, adding thousands of miles and weeks to every voyage. Watching only one of these at a time gives you a distorted picture. Watching all 3 together tells a completely different story. So let's build the timeline. The timeline. The war itself began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel struck Iranian military targets. Iran responded almost immediately by declaring the Strait of Hormuz closed to shipping, backing that declaration with strikes and mines. That closure has held with only one meaningful interruption. A memorandum of understanding in mid-June briefly reopened the strait to limited traffic. It lasted about 3 weeks before breaking down in early July after attacks on commercial vessels resumed. Since then, Hormuz has been back to what monitoring services now describe as effectively closed, convoy transits under naval escort, a small fraction of the roughly 70-plus vessels a day that used to pass through before the war. That's choke point 1. Iran didn't need to sink an armada to shut it. It needed to make the insurance math impossible, and it did. So Saudi Arabia adapted. It has a pipeline, the East-West line, that lets it move millions of barrels a day from its eastern oil fields straight to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, completely bypassing Hormuz. When Hormuz closed, Yanbu exports didn't just increase. According to maritime intelligence tracking, they surged roughly 5-fold, from around 760,000 barrels a day before the crisis to nearly 3.8 million barrels a day. That pipeline became Saudi Arabia's insurance policy. It became the kingdom's way of saying, you can close one door, we'll use the other. Then on July 20th, the Houthis in Yemen, aligned with Iran, declared a naval blockade specifically targeting Saudi-flagged shipping through el-Mandeb. Within days, 2 tankers carrying a combined 2.8 million barrels of Saudi crude bound for buyers in China and India reversed course mid-transit and turned north for the Suez route instead. Other vessels followed. By the following week, reported strikes on Saudi-linked tankers in that strait had reached 4. That's choke point 2, closed just as deliberately as choke point 1, and closed specifically to neutralize the workaround Saudi Arabia built to survive choke point 1's closure. Which brings us to Damietta, July 29th, 5 days after the el-Mandeb blockade was declared. A floating LNG terminal and an adjacent tanker caught fire at the northern gateway to Suez, the last remaining route for that Saudi crude now being turned away from the Red Sea's southern gate. No one has officially claimed it, but the message embedded in the target selection needs no confession to be legible. We can reach here too. 3 choke points, one after another, each one closing off exactly where the traffic being pushed out of the previous one was headed. That is not random escalation, that is a sequence. What the numbers actually mean. Here's what this looks like in practice, away from the headlines. Ocean carriers that would normally run the Red Sea and Suez route are now diverting around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, instead. That adds somewhere in the range of 3,500 to 4,000 nautical miles and 10 to 14 days to a single voyage between Asia and Europe or the Middle East. War risk insurance premiums on vessels still willing to transit the region have reportedly risen 4 to 5 times over pre-war levels because most policies carry a 72-hour cancellation clause that lets insurers reprice risk the moment a conflict escalates. And this one keeps escalating. Multiply that by the volume of trade actually running through these lanes, and you start to see why this isn't an abstract geopolitical story. It's freight rates, it's fuel costs, it's the price of goods that were sitting on a container ship 2 months ago and are only now approaching a port because the ship took the long way around a continent to get there. And the closures aren't uniform. That's the part worth sitting with. Reporting on Hormuz traffic has noted that shipping tied to Chinese buyers and operators has continued to move with far less friction than vessels flagged to Saudi Arabia or other U.S.-aligned states, including at least one case of a Chinese tanker being explicitly granted safe passage by the Houthis after initially turning back. Whether that reflects a formal arrangement or simply informal deconfliction, the practical effect is the same. This isn't a blanket closure of global shipping. It's a selective one, and the selection criteria appear to track very closely with who the ship serves. The Steelman case now, I want to stop and make the strongest case for why none of this should be read as catastrophically as I've been framing it, because a fair analysis has to survive contact with its best counter-argument, not just the weak version of it. Argument 1, this is a hard problem with no clean solution. Closing Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez approach nearly simultaneously is an extraordinarily difficult position for any power to counter without a level of military escalation that could be far more costly than the shipping disruption itself. Choosing not to immediately force all 3 corridors open by fire isn't necessarily weakness. It can be a judgment that the economic and human cost of that fight exceeds the cost of rerouting trade. Argument 2, diplomacy hasn't been abandoned. There have been multiple rounds of indirect talks over the course of this war, including the mid-June memorandum that did briefly reopen Hormuz. A channel that reopened once can in principle reopen again. The existence of failed negotiations isn't proof that negotiation is pointless when wars end through exactly this kind of repeated frustrating process more often than they end through decisive victory. Argument 3, the alternative is worse. Forcing all 3 corridors open simultaneously would likely require sustained military operations across multiple fronts at once, with real risk of casualties, further regional escalation, and no guarantee the closures wouldn't simply resume once forces stood down. There's a real argument that managing the disruption, accepting higher shipping costs, and rerouted trade is the less destructive path, even if it's the less satisfying one to watch. Those arguments have genuine weight. I'm not going to pretend they don't, but here's what none of them explain: the pattern of sequencing. If this were simply an intractable problem being managed as carefully as possible, you would not expect the closures to track so precisely onto each other's overflow routes. Hormuz closes. Yanbu absorbs the traffic. Yanbu's route through Bab el-Mandeb gets blockaded 5 months later. Specifically targeting Saudi-flagged vessels, traffic reroutes to Suez. 5 days after that blockade is announced, the Suez approach gets hit. Each closure lands almost exactly where the previous closure's runoff was headed. A party that were simply reacting to opportunities as they arose might produce one or two of these in sequence, by chance, 3 in a row, each one closing the specific door the previous closure opened, is a harder thing to explain as coincidence. And the selective enforcement, vessels tied to one buyer moving freely, while vessels tied to another get struck, is also difficult to square with this is chaotic and hard to control. Selective enforcement requires exactly the kind of command and coordination that this is spiraling out of anyone's control would predict against. The 1796 warning. Now I want to take you somewhere that might feel like a detour, but I promise it isn't. In September of 1796, George Washington was preparing to leave the presidency, and he used his farewell to the nation to warn against something specific, the danger of what he called passionate attachments to foreign nations, and the mirror danger of inveterate antipathies toward others. His argument was that a nation that lets emotional loyalty, rather than cold calculation of its own interest, steer its foreign policy will eventually find itself dragged into conflicts that serve someone else's interest more than its own. He warned against entangling alliances that bind a country's hands in advance before it can weigh a crisis on its own terms. Apply that lens to the last 5 months. The United States has been navigating a war shaped at every turn by the security needs of regional partners whose interests only partly overlap with its own. Partners whose own choices about war and peace are made independently, sometimes without full coordination, and which the U.S. then has to absorb the consequences of. That is close to exactly the mechanism Washington was describing. A country's freedom to act on its own calculations getting narrowed by its commitments to others. I want to be careful here because historical analogies get misused constantly, usually by stretching a 2-century-old text to fit whatever argument someone already wanted to make. But the structural point Washington was making wasn't really about Britain or France in 1796. It was about a mechanism, how alliances, once passionate rather than purely interest-based, remove a nation's ability to choose its own moment and manner of engagement. That mechanism doesn't expire. It's playing out in the Gulf right now, just with different flags on the ships. What to watch next? Here are 3 concrete checkable things over the coming weeks that will tell you which direction this is actually heading, not which direction the headlines say it's heading. 1. Watch whether Hormuz traffic recovers or stays suppressed. The mid-June reopening lasted roughly 3 weeks before collapsing. If any future ceasefire or agreement produces a reopening that holds for longer than that previous attempt, that's a genuine signal of change. If it collapses again on a similar timeline, the pattern has simply repeated. 2. Watch the shipping data at Bab el-Mandeb, not the statements about it. Vessel tracking is public. If tankers tied to one set of buyers keep transiting without incident while tankers tied to another keep getting struck, yeah, that selective pattern, not any diplomatic announcement, is the real indicator of who currently controls outcomes in that strait. 3. Watch Suez and the northern Red Sea over the next few weeks. One incident at Damietta could be an isolated event. A second strike anywhere near that corridor would confirm this is a deliberate third front, not a one-off. None of these require insider access. They're publicly trackable, and they'll tell you more than any single press conference will. Closing 3 choke points, 1 conflict, each closure landing precisely where the last one's overflow was headed, an enforcement that looks selective rather than chaotic. Whatever you conclude about who's ultimately responsible for each individual incident, the sequencing itself is the story. Because sequences that consistent are not what an uncontrolled spiraling crisis usually looks like. They're what a controlled one looks like. Washington spent his farewell address trying to describe the mechanism by which a nation loses the ability to act purely on its own calculation. He wasn't writing about the Gulf, but the mechanism he described doesn't need him to have been. I'll see you in the next one.